The first thing I noticed wasn't the champagne flutes or the way the chandelier light kept catching on the cut glass like a nervous habit, it was the seating. Marissa at the head of the table as if she'd been practicing there. My parents arranged to either side, the good china out on a weeknight for just dinner, and a stack of gift bags half hidden by the plant that has survived our family longer than most apologies. I came in with the weather on my shoulders, set my water down, and felt the room waiting in the same way a stage waits when the curtain is too slow. "So next month I'll be moving into your place," Marissa said with the kind of smile people use when they announce they've switched to almond milk, a change so benign you'd be rude not to applaud. "Just until I figure things out." My father laughed in relief, popped the champagne, filled crystal flutes I'd never seen before in this century, lifted his glass toward me, and said, "To new beginnings." As if intentions are the only paperwork a life needs. I didn't lift mine. 3 days earlier I'd found storage tubs in my garage labeled Marissa's Winter and Marissa's Books, big plastic drums of inevitability stacked where my toolbox should have been. When I'd texted her a polite question, she'd sent back a screenshot of a heart and the words, "Just temporary," which is what we call permanence before we can afford it. Now she accepted her flute like a guest of honor and kept talking. She'd already started boxing. She'd need the front bedroom because light helps her mood. She'd be bringing Kiki the cat and sometimes Kiki's boyfriend, which, I learned only then, meant a second cat. "Your place is too big for one person," Mom said in the voice of people who narrate destiny. "And this will be so good for you, Ethan. You get company, accountability, home-cooked meals." I looked at the china, at the napkin rings my grandmother never liked, and realized the arrangement had been laid the way a path is laid, a little too straight, a little too clean, cutting right across anyone inconvenient enough to stand on it. I reached under my chair and slid out the manila envelope I wasn't sure I'd need tonight, and should have left in the car if I wanted a quiet drive home. "I've got some things too," I said, and it surprised me how calm my voice sounded, as if I'd been coaching it off stage for weeks. My mother's smile dimmed by a single what, my father's brow folded itself into the wrinkle he saves for taxes, and Marissa widened her eyes just enough to say please don't wreck the scene. Even her posture went theatrical, shoulders back, chin soft, the pose of someone who believes generosity is a prop. What I could have said, I could have told them about the copy keys I found in a kitchen drawer that had never belonged to her, the locksmith receipt dated the week she'd looked after the place. While I traveled, the cousin who asked whether family rate meant utilities included because Marissa had mentioned subletting one of Ethan's extra rooms. I could have described the pinned message at the top of the family thread where she wrote, as me, that we were working out a timeline. The phrasing I never use and the triple exclamation I never type, the way she harvests consensus like it's low fruit. But tonight wasn't for explanations that left the center empty. It was for putting the center back where it belonged. I placed 4 documents on the table: the deed with just my name, the mortgage note that does not list a sibling addendum, the insurance declaration page that calls me sole owner of both risk and roof, and a printed copy of Mom's own text from last year saying, "Your house, your rules." The day she liked that phrase because it helped her win a different argument. "We can talk about company any time," I said. "But moving in is a decision that requires me in it." My father's mouth opened and closed twice like a fish adjusting to air. My mother began to form the word family. Marissa laughed a little too brightly and said, "It's already in motion." I turned my phone so the table could see what I'd found that afternoon, a neighborhood post in Marissa's words announcing a graceful transition at my address and thanking our supportive community for welcoming her. The photo cropped so close it decapitated the date on my mailbox. "You can't put toothpaste back in the tube," Dad said, not unkindly, as if physics were on his side. "You can cancel a plan that wasn't yours to make," I answered, and slid the envelope back to my lap because if I left it there, someone would call it a threat. The glasses stayed raised, a toast waiting for a cue I wasn't going to deliver. The chandelier ticked as if a moth were inside it. Aunt Sarah cleared her throat and said something about what your mother wanted, a phrase that enters rooms like a borrowed robe. I thought of my mother's handwriting on a recipe card, the way she loops her Y's like open arms, and I realized how easily a wish can be weaponized into an order if you pronounce it with enough confidence. Marissa leaned in, lowered her voice into the register that always recruits Mom, and said, "Let's not make this ugly, okay? We're just confirming what's already agreed. It would have been easy to stand, to pace, to siphon dignity into volume, but I've learned that shouting is a poor imitation of proof, so I breathed, counted the forks, and said, then let's do something simple. Put on the table exactly who agreed to what, and when." The champagne went flat a little in the glasses while we waited for someone to volunteer a timeline that didn't exist. I took a sip of water that tasted like memory and placed one more page down, not a legal document, just a calendar grid with 3 dates circled and the words key copies, listing draft, and forum post written in my tidy print. There are rooms where a map is more dangerous than a sermon. This was one of them. "Ethan," my mother said quietly, and I braced for the story that turns disobedience into illness. "Don't be difficult." It was not a plea. It was a sentence. I looked at my sister, at the place my coat had hung since high school, and thought, enough. "Before anyone moves into my house," I said, "we're going to move the truth into this room." And then I opened the envelope. Patterns don't announce themselves when you're inside them. They feel like weather, changeable but inevitable, until one day you hang up a wet coat and realize you've been living in the rain by choice. Mine had a simple shape. Marissa initiates, my parents endorse, I absorb. The week we all remember when she borrowed my truck and my insurance premium learned a new number. The month Dad paid her credit card and called it a bridge. The season Mom gave her the guest room. For 2 weeks. That stretched into 6 months and ended not with gratitude but with an accusation that I didn't visit enough. Every role had muscle memory. Tonight I was supposed to prove I remembered mine. 3 mornings before the dinner I'd been hunting a hex key in the kitchen junk drawer and found a pair of newly cut house keys taped together with blue painter's tape, the kind locksmiths use when they label duplicates before a pickup. The tag read front/dead plus garage in someone else's hand. Behind them, a receipt with my address and a date from the week I'd flown out for work while Marissa checked on Kiki's feeding. The locksmith's shop is 2 blocks from my mother's dry cleaner. I took a photo as the coffee finished and wrote a polite sentence in my lemon yellow notebook, confirm key provenance. On the same day, a cousin messaged me, casually, cheerfully, to ask whether the family rate meant utilities were included. Like Mari said in the chat. And suddenly a room in my house I hadn't offered had a price point and a marketing arm. I scrolled the thread I'd muted months ago and found Marissa's fingerprints on half a dozen updates, sent as if by me. "We're working out timing. Ethan's being modest. I'll coordinate logistics." She even used the word gracious, a word I save for funerals and strangers who rescue dogs. I screen recorded the scroll so no one could later claim a crop, and I put it in a folder on my phone labeled, "With petty satisfaction, this happened." The day before dinner I took 2 hours off and drove to the county office, where title records smell like dust and promises. The clerk printed me a clean copy of the deed and a page that shows the chain of ownership like a family tree that doesn't lie. A quiet relief settled into my shoulders as the laser printer warmed. Sometimes the mercy of paper is not that it loves you, but that it doesn't know how to flatter a story. I added the mortgage note and the insurance declarations from my email, then asked the bank to put a verbal password on my accounts because love has never once been harmed by a second lock. What I didn't do was call Marissa. Not because I wanted to surprise her, but because she is fluent in rehearsals. Give her time and she will draft a narrative tight as a corset, add 3 sympathetic witnesses, and preload a dozen texts she can send from the bathroom. Better to let the story meet the table before it could dress itself. At dinner she played her part like a favorite song. "It's what Mom wants," she said, which is our family's spell for turning preference into law. Mom nodded at the word wants even though 6 months ago she had texted me, unprompted, the now printed line "Your house, your rules," a sentence she loved until she didn't. Dad proposed compromise, which in our family means I keep the cost and she keeps the keys. Aunt Sarah mentioned mental health and companionship, which is how people launder entitlement when rent is due. I set the key receipt on the table alongside the deed and watched as shock hopped from face to face, doing little jumps like a nervous bird pecking crumbs of accountability. Who authorized duplicates? I asked, and nobody answered because answers are commitments, and commitments become rails you can be held to. Marissa reached for sympathy with the effortless grace of long practice. She had felt unsafe, she said, walking alone at night from her apartment to the bus stop. She needed proximity to family. She had told everyone that this was happening and everyone was excited, a vague army she deploys when she wants to turn a wish into a consensus. Mom added that the house was too big for me and made more sense as multi-generational living, which is the term our family uses when my square footage is free but hers is for guests. Let me be plain, I said, keeping my voice low because low is how you make people lean in. Nobody moves anywhere until we agree. And right now we don't agree on the facts. I tapped the calendar page I'd brought, 3 dates circled and annotated, key copies, listing draft, forum post. If you disagree with this, correct the dates. If you disagree with the ownership, correct the deed. If you disagree with the sentence your house, your rules, correct Mom's text. Silence is not always guilt, but tonight it dressed the part. Marissa tried to fill it with a laugh, then with a sigh, then with the kind of tears that hover without falling so they can be both evidence and threat. Dad told me not to be legalistic, which is what people say when the law has arrived to end the party, and I thought about how long I had been expected to be a buffet. Take what you want, no need to ask, the food refills itself. Here's what happens next, I said, sliding the envelope back shut, smooth as a curtain. Tomorrow at 7 we meet at my place. Bring whatever promises you believe were made. I'll bring whatever papers actually exist. I stood, not to dominate but to indicate we were finished with hypotheticals. And Marissa, I added, do not bring movers. She laughed at that, high and quick. Don't be dramatic, she said, because irony is a language some people speak without accent. The next morning my doorbell rang at exactly 7. I own a doorbell I have never liked. It plays a cheerful tune that has always felt like an apology for boundaries, a chime that invites entry instead of announcing a threshold. At 7 sharp it trilled its little song, and I opened to find my parents, Marissa, and Aunt Sarah on the porch in the formation of a committee that has already voted. Behind them, in the dark beyond the porch light, a van idled with 2 silhouettes. Not movers, exactly, but the kind of friends who lift boxes for Instagram stories. I stepped out, pulled the door behind me so the threshold was firmly under my heel, and said, "Phone's on the table by the entry." It sounds theatrical until you've survived a family where a private conversation becomes a group chat before dessert. When your army is screenshots, the first rule of peace is disarmament. To their credit, they complied with all the stiffness of righteousness holding its breath. We sat at the dining table I bought at a thrift store the year I finally earned more than my rent, a table that remembers late-night spreadsheets, and the first time I said out loud, "This is mine." I placed a folder in the center and laid out the sequence as if I were teaching a basic skill: deed, mortgage note, insurance declarations, screenshots of posts and texts, with times, the locksmith receipt, and a printout of the neighborhood forum announcement with a timestamp that pointed to Marissa's login. "Mom," I said gently, "you have a text 6 months old that says your house, your rules. Did you change your mind and forget to tell me, or are we calling last week's group message proof of a decision I didn't make?" She winced at seeing her sentence in print. Few people like their sincerity reflected back to them, and shook her head. "I said that," she admitted, "but we didn't know then how lonely you were." I smiled because it's either laugh or weep when loneliness becomes the reason someone borrows your bathroom without knocking. Marissa slid forward a single piece of paper with theatrical care. "Mom said I could," she announced, and my father aligned himself behind the word said like it had a notarization. The page was a printed email from my mother to Aunt Sarah about how nice it would be if Marissa were close by, ending with, "Ethan will come around," which in our dialect means, "Ethan will bankroll it." I highlighted nothing because highlighters can look like anger. I just asked, "Where is my promise?" What I offered next was not a trap but a door. "If you want to live here," I said, looking only at Marissa, "we do what adults do. We run an application, check income, set a lease, collect a deposit, and hold each other to it. No subletting cousins, no on animals from rescue impulsivity, and no family rate you negotiated on my behalf without the landlord present. If you'd like a roommate, apply like a roommate." I wanted her to hear the dignity in that offer. I was not denying her shelter. I was denying her entitlement. She recoiled as if fairness were an insult. "I'm your sister," she said, "a fact that in our family has often served as both ID and coupon. Family doesn't charge rent." Dad nodded so hard the table wobbled. "If you can afford a mortgage," he added, "you can afford generosity." The sermon landed heavy with the assumption that my job is to be a well, not a person. "Generosity," I said, "is what I choose to give. A house," I added, "is what I choose to keep." I turned to my aunt. "Sarah, you told the forum I was transitioning gracefully, and suggested neighbors welcome Marissa home. Did you mean her home or mine?" She blushed the way childhood friends blush when they realize proximity is not license, then whispered, "I wanted to help." "Help," I said, "opens toward the person it claims to serve." What no one expected was the next page, a change of address confirmation I'd received that morning from the USPS, submitted online for Marissa, forwarding her mail to my address effective next week. I set it gently on the table. The implication was loud enough to wake the dead. "That's not what it looks like," she said, "because of course it never is." I told them what would happen if we pretended this was a misunderstanding and let it roll us. Spare keys multiplied, narratives hardened, my house life hacked into a multi-generational resource. Any attempt later to restore a boundary painted as betrayal. I told them what would happen instead. The keys would be rekeyed today, any entry without permission treated like what it is, any roommate arrangement negotiated on paper with the landlord present. "I am the landlord," I said, not to be grand but to be exact. Dad stood up like a statue about to be cited, and for a heartbeat I thought he would go for volume. Instead he surprised me with a tired kind of quiet. "You don't have to do this, son," he said, and it sounded almost tender. "You can make it easy." I nodded. "I could," I said. "But then it would be easy for only one person." I walked to the door, opened it to the cool morning, and nodded toward the idling van. "Tell your friends to go," I said to Marissa. "If they need a reason, tell them the lease didn't clear." When I returned to the table, nobody reached for the champagne. And then my phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood group. "Welcome, Marissa. So excited for your move-in. Let us know if you need extra hands." I turned the screen so they could read it, then reached for my folder. If they wanted a move-in story, I would give it one, the kind with a timeline and a lock. By noon the locksmith had replaced the cylinders with a competence I found almost medicinal. He did not ask for backstory, did not comment on family, simply handed me 3 keys and an invoice that felt like a receipt for peace. One set for me, one for a fire-safe envelope at Ruth's house across the street, and one sealed in a plastic bag labeled emergency that we both initialed. He left behind the old brass like a pile of shed skins. I kept one on the counter as a reminder that doors are not metaphors until you forget their hardware first. Then I began the part that looks like overkill to anyone who has never been rewritten. I made a timeline document with screenshots embedded, dates in the margins, links to the forum posts and the change of address confirmation, and photos of the duplicate key receipt and the entrance of the locksmith's shop with its timestamped security camera in the background. I added Mom's 6-month-old text, "Dad's? Make it easy. Marissa's. It's already in motion." And Aunt Sarah's. "Welcome home." It read less like a prosecution than like a weather report that refused to call a hurricane. Light rain. I invited them all back for dinner at my place. Control loves a home field advantage. It was time I used mine for something besides watering plants. If the earlier meeting had been triage, this would be diagnosis, prognosis, treatment. I asked Ruth to sit in, not as a bouncer but as a witness with a teapot. I laid out plates and set the good knives down the way you set down facts, sharp, useful, not for pointing. They arrived in a hush, the kind that plays at humility but wears a hint of siege. Mom carried a casserole, which is what we bring when we plan to change the subject after dessert. Dad avoided the wall where the photo frames used to hang because I had put them into storage, and absence sometimes says more than any speech. Marissa came last, eyes already wet, the preamble to a performance that has historically extracted concessions. We ate because to skip food is to invite adrenaline, and adrenaline doesn't know syntax. After plate 2, I set the teapot down and slid the timeline across the table. We're going to read a story together, I said, not smiling. It has dates. If I misremember any, this is the time to correct them. I pressed play on the screen recording of the family chat, the messages blooming one after another with their cheerful bubbles. Ethan says we're working out timing, not me, family rate, not me, move-in day, not me. I let the room watch itself. It's disorienting to see your own behavior behave in front of you. I played the forum post and then the change of address confirmation, and watched Dad rub his temple the way he does when a bill arrives with a fee for something imagined. Aunt Sarah whispered, "Oh," twice in a way that meant she had found her own face in the mirror. Mom tried to float the word miscommunication like a raft. I let it drift until it found the fact that sank it. Then, because it matters that a boundary isn't just a wall but a door with a rule, I slid across a one-page document titled House Access and Residency Policy. It read like IKEA instructions, except the furniture was my life. No entry without permission. No guests who drop by for weeks. Any proposed co-living requires a standard application, income verification, lease, deposit, and house expectations listed plainly. Animals by prior approval only. No online posts about my home without my consent. This isn't cold, I said gently. It's what warmth sits inside. Marissa took a breath to argue and then stopped when Ruth poured tea into her cup like she was topping off a gas tank. We can try again later, I offered, but it won't be like this. And it won't be a surprise. Dad asked if I was going to press charges, and I said no, not unless a lock had an opinion. I'm asking for 2 things, I added. Stop telling people I agreed to what I didn't. Stop acting like my silence is consent. The casserole cooled into something starchy and not unkind. Mom set down her fork with a clink and said, in a voice that contained a small apology like a toothpick, "We should have asked." It was not confession, but it was a change of altitude. Aunt Sarah texted the neighborhood group a correction while we watched, her thumbs moving the way people move when they realize they've mistaken someone's house for a community center. Marissa looked at the policy as if it were a negotiation table she'd never seen before and said, "So if I apply?" And I nodded, grateful to hear a grown-up tense. We were paying the check of the evening when my phone buzzed with a notification that someone had tried to log into my smart lock app from an unrecognized device. In the photo captured by the doorbell camera, 2 of Marissa's friends stood under the porch light holding a toolbox like a punchline. I didn't raise my voice. I walked to the door, opened it, and said, "It's a no tonight," in the tone you use with dogs you like. One of them joked, "We come in peace," and I answered, "Then you'll leave in it." They left. It wasn't cinematic. It was better. I closed the door and turned back to my family, who looked smaller in a way that made me feel larger but not victorious, not yet. There was one more thing to do that wasn't going to happen in my dining room. The thing about families is that they are magnetic fields for narrative. If you don't set your true north, someone else will hold up a fridge magnet and call it geography. The morning after dinner I filed a simple notice with the local police department's non-emergency line, a trespass letter on file naming my address, describing who had access and who didn't, and asking for a courtesy patrol if calls came in. It wasn't a threat, it was the polite equivalent of putting a reflector on a mailbox so drivers stopped pretending they didn't see it. Then I emailed the neighborhood forum moderator and asked them to attach a note to Aunt Sarah's correction. Please refrain from organizing around moving plans that are not confirmed by the homeowner. I copied Marissa so the sentence would land where it needed to. I also called the post office, because not all harm arrives with a crowbar. I canceled the unauthorized change of address and added a PIN requirement for any future requests. The clerk, cheerful in the way of people who find joy in predictable systems, told me, "Good move," and I felt a small square in my chest click into place. By afternoon, the group text had cooled into logistics about who was bringing dessert to Sunday dinner. Nobody wanted to return to the scene of last night's narrative wreck. Around 4, Marissa sent a single-line message, "We need to talk before this gets worse." I replied with a time and a location, my porch, 6 o'clock, daylight still honest, doorbell camera on. She arrived at 6:10 with a paper in her hand. "A letter," she said. "From Mom." It was not a letter so much as a pressure valve wrapped in stationery. "We always hoped the house would be a place for both of you, perhaps in hard times, perhaps just for companionship." It never said Ethan promises or Marissa will move in, but it held its arms out in a way that invited assumption. I read it twice, then handed it back. I loved her wishes, I said, but she didn't write contracts. If she wanted to, she would have. She didn't. Marissa tried a new angle, a kind of fatigued sincerity. She was between jobs again. Her last roommate had bailed, rent had gone up, and she had tried, really tried, to keep her head above numbers that wouldn't stop multiplying. I believed her. Empathy is the least expensive kindness I have left. But belief is not the same currency as access. "If you need help," I said, "I'll call in favors, forward job leads, even cover a deposit for a place that is not this one." "If you want to live here, you apply." She said she wouldn't do paperwork with family. Which is how some people say I want the perks without the parts that bind me. I said that paperwork is what keeps love from becoming alone. We looked at each other for a long minute, two people whose childhoods had taught them different lessons about the same house. That night someone posted a photo of my place to a private Facebook group with the caption, "Finally moving day." It was a shot from the sidewalk, an angle that made my front window look like a mouth. I didn't reply there. I sent the post to the same folder where I'd kept everything else, labeled the file with the date, and poured myself water as if hydration were a form of discipline. The last attempt came on Saturday, a rental van I recognized from 2 nights ago, idling in front of my driveway while Marissa stood with a tote bag and a look that said the story had decided to end differently. I met them on the walk, policy in hand, not waving it, just letting it be seen. "We're not doing this," I said, because sometimes the sentence has to be as short as a lock's click. "Call the police then," one of the friends said, bravado looking for an audience. "If you think you're right." He didn't know that right had nothing to do with my willingness to dial. He also didn't know about the letter on file. I dialed anyway, chose the non-emergency option, gave my address, said the word trespass once in a voice that I kept even, and thanked the dispatcher like she was refilling my coffee. The patrol car rolled up faster than embarrassment. The officer stepped out, listened to both of us without rolling his eyes even once, then asked one question that ended the opera. "Whose name is on the deed?" When I answered, he nodded, turned to Marissa, and said, "Ma'am, you can work this out privately, but you can't move in tonight without his permission." He didn't shame her. He didn't cheer me. He just set the furniture where it belongs. The van left. Marissa did, too, without meeting my eyes. The driveway felt longer when it was empty. I stood there for a ridiculous minute like a man who'd wrestled a bear and realized it was only a costume, and only then did my knees discover they had opinions about the day. That evening I wrote one more email, not to an officer or a moderator, but to myself, a list of what I wanted if we were ever going to be a family that didn't treat my house like a public good. It wasn't long. It had verbs: ask, apply, respect, stop. I put it in the folder with everything else and named it North. Sunday dinner felt like walking into a room that had been rearranged 5 inches in every direction. Nothing was where muscle memory thought it would be, but you couldn't accuse anyone of renovation. Dad hugged me in a way that was less performance and more human. Mom set a bowl in the center of the table and didn't angle it toward Marissa as if food had favorites. Marissa arrived late, no entourage, hair pulled back, a look that said she had been speaking to consequences and found them attentive. We made it to dessert, store-bought pie, unashamed, before Aunt Sarah asked if we could clear the air, which is the opening act for either surrender or another storm. I nodded. Here's the air, I said. I'm not angry. I am done doing things in the wrong order. I slid copies of the house access and residency policy around like placemats and added a second sheet titled Help I Can Offer Instead, Job Leads, a deposit loan repayable in installments, 3 people willing to take a call on her behalf if she wanted the introduction, and the name of a shared co-working space I'd prepaid for a month so she'd have somewhere to sit that wasn't her bed. Marissa read in the quiet that follows a healthy kind of embarrassment. So I can't live here, she said finally. Not unless you apply and we sign a lease like adults, I answered. And if I do? She asked, almost as if testing whether adulthood had an address. Then we talk like landlords and tenants, I said. Which is to say, like 2 people whose boundaries make possible the fact that they still like each other. Dad surprised me by saying, that seems fair. And Mom surprised herself by not correcting him. Aunt Sarah apologized for the forum post in a tone that sounded like someone learning a new language in mid-sentence. Then Marissa reached into her bag and pulled out a single key on a hardware store ring. It looked, in her palm, like an answer. I didn't use it, she said. And I'm not going to. She set it on the table and the room inhaled in one piece. We didn't clap. We didn't make a speech. We ate pie. Sometimes the best part of a boundary is that it makes room for dessert. Over the next weeks, ordinary life did what it always does when you stop trying to script it for strangers. It resumed. I mowed the lawn. Ruth brought over a handful of tomatoes because they were ripening too fast. My doorbell played its dumb cheerful tune and for once I didn't resent it. Marissa texted me 2 job postings and asked which looked reasonable. I told her both and offered to read her cover letter for commas only, not content. She sent me a selfie outside an interview with a thumbs up and no caption. I sent back a thumbs up and the luck emoji I used to make fun of. I kept the folder, deed, screenshots, policy, letter, timeline, north, not as a trophy but as a toolkit. I moved it from my desk to the top drawer where the takeout menus live because both are kinds of planning. Both help prevent the sort of hunger that makes you say yes when you mean no. If I never open it again, it will have done its job. If I need it, it will be where I put it, which is the most honest sentence I know about peace. A month later we tried a smaller dinner, just the 4 of us, no audience. Dad asked about the new project at work without using it to measure whether I could sponsor someone else's choices. Mom told a story about Grandma that made us all laugh from the place where love isn't a weapon. Marissa sat beside me and showed me an apartment listing she could actually afford if she got the job. The street looked safe, the windows looked honest, and the building had a no cats rule which I suspected would become a yes with a deposit and a promise. When she left, she hugged me in that tentative way people do when they're still drafting a memory that won't embarrass them later. I'm sorry, she said quietly. And for once it didn't sound like bait. I'm learning. Me too, I said, because humility is a better lock than a pad of rules. Back home, I stood in my doorway, listened to my doorbell be itself, and touched the inside trim where my coat has rubbed the paint smooth over years. The house made its small evening noises, pipes chuckling, fridge settling, wood shifting its weight like a tired animal finding comfort. I hung my keys on their hook and waited for the clink. It came, ordinary and perfect, a sound so small you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. A story like this doesn't end with fireworks. It ends with a room where the furniture is where you left it and the people you love knock before opening the door. That, I've decided, is the quiet kind of revenge worth keeping, not that anyone pays, but that no one takes without asking again.